So, what is the legacy of architectural principles? Wickover's architectural principles.
Well, as always
What can we?
happens, really influential people get slammed by one or two generations later. And after the oncoming of heavy duty post structuralist criticism in the 70s and 80s, uh, everybody was on uh, Wickover's back for his claims of Palladio's harmonic proportions based on music, and showing that the proportional system which he deduced from the plates of the theory book, the four books of architecture of 1570, uh, people found holes in the argument persuasively, particularly Deborah Howard and Bruno Branko Mitrovic. Uh, just went after it. The same was true of Panofsky, who was the person who led me to the documents of Milan, which was really very nice. I was in a course with him, and he said, "Look here, these documents have been published, and nobody ever did anything with it." And so started as a term paper and ended as an article that had been cited more than anything I've ever written. And uh, so Panofsky came under fire from a number of different directions. Gombrich started going after him for his Hegelian approach, and then the younger generation jumped on board. And yet, I think Panofsky is maybe the most exciting art historian of our time.
Well, I always think of Wickover's architectural principles and your Milan article as two benchmarks in the history of architectural proportion, and yet I find them to be very different in method and approach. How would you characterize Wickover's historical method in that work?
Well, Wickover uh, brought a whole new level to architectural history in two respects. Prior to him, uh, theory had never been a very major interest. The publication on broader issues of the Renaissance uh, didn't get into what had been written at the time. Uh, an example of this not getting into it is a book by Geoffrey Scott of 1914 called The Architecture of Humanism, which treated the whole thing in a very subjective way, like Burke. And so theory enters and gives some kind of foundation for the way to approach design. And the other thing was drawings. Now, that doesn't come into the book so much, but Wickover was a very significant contributor to the introduction of architectural drawings into the discussion of the history of architecture. It's amazing how little they were considered at that time, and it opened a field it led in Witkover's study of Bernini, for example, to a whole new approach. It's interesting that when I got to Italy to do my dissertation, I started with working in the drawing cabinet of the Uffizi Gallery, which had thousands of architectural drawings. And these had been of so little interest up to this time that when the curators brought me folders of drawings, there were big sheets of butcher paper in which the drawings were just thrown. And they could easily scatter all over the desk and fall on the floor. They were so indifferent to this that they allowed me to go out on the balcony and pin them, not through the paper, but just by pressure, onto a board and take photographs. So you could see how primitive the interest in architectural drawings were, and these were the two major contributions of Witkover. And I don't think that that the book on architectural principles deals significantly with drawings. It might have been interesting in the case of, let's say, the Palladio things, to compare what was in the 4 books to Palladio drawings, many of which are preparation drawings for the 4 books. But this, I don't really criticize him for that, because that wasn't the focus of more than an article, and it had a great impact without drawings at that point. But in any case, he was a very innovative historian. And also, thinking of him personally, he really encouraged a student, a whole period of students at Columbia, to go into the field and to make really important contributions. Howard Hibbard, Milton Levine, and others. And so he was a really important figure.
So going back to the theory portion of his contribution, at what point does theory become reality? At what point does theory cease to be merely an interpretation, but actually start influencing architecture in visible ways? Is there a Renaissance proportional system that helps create the Renaissance style, and a Gothic proportional system that helps create the Gothic style, or are they merely ways for us to understand these styles?
Renaissance theory, beginning with Alberti, who finished his book in 1450. It was only published in the 90s. Well, as an example of the interest, Lorenzo the Magnificent was building a villa on the outskirts of Florence at Poggio a Caiano, and he ordered his sidekick to get the manuscript from Alberti in order for him to read what had happened there, and it influenced the design of that villa that has a very mathematical underpinning, and in which axes and cross axes are imposed on it, rather than distribute the windows in terms of internal relevance. They were distributed in terms of a mathematical grid. And so there's a lot of influence that Palladio, his theory, was far more influential than his work. For example, almost nobody ever went to see the Palladio villas or palaces. They looked at the book and they read the measurements, and it was on this base that you had this incredible spread of Palladian architecture across the Western world. In the U.S., Thomas Jefferson had a very strong influence from Palladio, which he got from a edition, not very accurate, of Palladio's work, published in 1715 in London, a very luxurious edition, and he used this for the design of his villas, country houses in America. Then, when he was appointed to be the ambassador to Spain, to France, I'm sorry, he made one trip to Italy and got to Milan and Genoa, and didn't go the few hours over to Vicenza and Verona to see Palladio works. And what he did was to go in the opposite direction into Piedmont in order to get samples of rice, because he wanted to encourage rice cultivation in the Carolinas. Very successful, actually. And he came back to Paris smuggling. It wasn't allowed to do this, smuggling rice samples to take back home. But he really missed it with respect to Palladio. Inigo Jones was the only architect that I know of the 17th century who bothered to go there. And there's a very interesting book of Inigo Jones, of the 4 books of architecture of Palladio, in which all the margins are filled with Jones's commentary on the subject. And Jones brought Palladio drawings back to London, and they constituted the first core of the huge drawings collection at the Royal Institute of British Architects. But he was unique.